start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master, Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, humbly we bow to you all. Be with us. Open our hearts and minds to your transforming presence, that we may know ourselves as we truly are, one with thy infinite light. I'm absolutely delighted to be here and to be here where I need to be. Oh, this is a microphone?
No, it's not. It's recording. It's recording. Yeah. So you need to stand.
Tell me where I need to be.
Yes, just here.
So I need to stand in front of it, but it's not amplifying.
No.
No, okay. So I need to speak up, which I will do my best to do. If you're having difficulty hearing me, I'll try to be louder. Okay? This is like the, except it's not all women up there. It's like you should have a curtain. You should be looking through a lattice or something like that. But in any case, we keep the child imprisoned up above him. Ryan, you can do a ton of mischief from up there. Maybe I shouldn't encourage him. He looks like he needs no encouragement, actually. In any case, I'm very, very happy to be here. The last time I was in Bangalore, I believe, was in 2012. That was the last time I saw Swami in India. Wait, would that have been 2013? Whatever it was. It was a while ago. There's a time warp that makes it hard for me to exactly remember when I was here. But it was a while ago. Swamiji was launching me on what is the phase of my life that's actually only beginning now, where he wanted me to expand my sense of responsibility from the one community in Palo Alto that I've been part of for 3 decades, and he actually wanted me to consider that the whole world was my place. I actually even asked him, when you said world, did you mean India? He said, no, I meant world. Then I asked him what he thought about the United States. His actual answer was, he said, I'm of 2 minds about the United States. I said, I am too, sir. I feel the same way. But he said, you go where there's energy. Just go around the world where there's energy. His instruction came to me in 2012, partly because it was one of, I didn't see him that much because he died less than a year after that conversation, although I did see him twice more, but I had to put that guidance of his aside for a while, primarily because I had a major writing project to do, which is part of what we're here today to talk about, which is Swami Kriyananda and the book I've written. Before some of you arrived, Roma stood up and just talked a little bit about the fact that we've all 3 of us been on the path together for a very long time. And in fact, when you said that to me, I don't know if you're going to remember this, Haridas, but the day that I moved to Ananda Village, which was June 1st, 1971, I met Swami Kriyananda just at the end of 1969, but I had a little complicated karma I had to untie before I could actually move. But my commitment to Swamiji began in 69 when I first met him. Ananda Village was not really a village at that point. It was mostly just land with a few random buildings. And the seclusion retreat, where a couple of you have been, I know, in your trips to America, very isolated piece of land, 3 miles up a very bad, rutted road, no amenities at all, no electricity, very few buildings, and the buildings were very primitive. And there was also, and the whole attitude about what we were doing was very much that we had dropped out of society, and we were very glad to have just washed our hands of the whole thing. And we were out in the forest with a great yogi, and we were there to find God. Swamiji had a different vision of where we would end up, but if in 1971 this had been described, we wouldn't have actually known what to do with it. I was 23, I think Haridas was about 18 or something, 19 maybe, something close to that. Haridas had arrived a year or two before I did. He was really right at the beginning. But the rule of life there was that no dwelling could be within sight or sound of any other. So every hermit got to just go out somewhere on that land, most of which was inaccessible by any means except footpaths. And Haridas was living in a teepee, and I came and set up a tent in a place that looked suitable to me, but Haridas could hear my teacup and my spoon. So very respectfully, but very definitely, he came over and said that he was really sorry, but this tent was going to have to be moved. And I remember about a week later, the temperature, well, for there it was hot. It was like 105 or something. It was June. It was a terrible hot day. But true to his word and absolutely unwavering in his determination, you helped clear another spot, and we practiced banging dishes together at that spot. And you went over to your house before you were willing to approve it. Fortunately, I was positively impressed rather than the opposite, and ever since then, we've all just been taking this journey together. Most of the time, our assignments have not coincided, but as you all are finding, and we all know, the bonds of being Gurubhais together are completely different than the bonds that come from personality affinity or shared interests of any kind. In fact, it's always been just a great, remarkable story to just see how diverse Master's family can be. That you try to get even a single sort of one principle about what really defines a Master's devotee, and it becomes very difficult to find it. And yet at the same time, all these diverse personalities are brought together, and we become friends in ways that we didn't even know friendship could exist. A friend of mine who came to Ananda first through the temple in Palo Alto, very outgoing woman at that time. She was a very successful businesswoman. She was in sales. As she herself said, she really knew how to work a room. She was very good at it. And she was drawn to the Ananda path. She loved everything that she was feeling there. So she began to apply to the congregation, to the Sangha there, the same rules that she'd applied everywhere else. And she was sort of just going around trying to make friends and it wasn't selfish. It was just, she was an extrovert. That was how she did it. Later she said it was as if she was invisible. She said no matter how hard she would try, and people were perfectly friendly. She said she was like made of Teflon. She was just slick, and that she couldn't make any contact with anyone. And this went on for a number of weeks in which, even in our fellowship hours, she just would feel like she was non-existent. She was very attractive, and there was just no sense to it. Finally, it occurred to her to just forget about the other people in the room, that she was going to concentrate on the altar. And this is the room she started working, She started really trying to get to know the masters and to get to know what we were all looking at. She said as soon as she made that decision, she started making friends. People started coming up and introducing themselves and inviting her to go out to coffee. And she said it was just like a night and day difference. And it was an extremely interesting story when I heard it, because it helped me to understand also sort of what we're doing and what makes Ananda what it is. What makes Ananda what it is that we're all looking in the same direction, attuning to a particular ray of grace, and our relationship with each other and the remarkable strength and harmony of Ananda that is now 50 years old and is now all over the world in all different cultures, is because we're not relating to each other like this. We're all relating to the same reality, and then God gives back to us, is the way it feels to me. He gives back to us attunement with each other. And then we develop these friendships, which even if years go by and we don't even have the opportunity because of circumstances, because 10,000 miles might separate us and different dharmas keep us occupied, the moment we come back together, it's like no time has passed, and all our experiences are along the same ray. Now, all of us live in this world. Everybody lives in this world alone, whether you live in family, whether you're a sannyasi, whatever it is that we do. We all have this, it's the way creation is made, where we all live from this certain perspective. I have come to define Master's phrase, spirit is center everywhere, circumference nowhere. I've thought of that from many different angles, but most recently, I've thought of that in a way that hadn't occurred to me before, which is it's also the definition of the life experience of every devotee, which is that we all live at a center of spirit from which we view everything. And even though with all that attunement we have to God and therefore with each other, every devotee also has to just come to the understanding that it's really just between me and God. That there's no form that's going to take the place of that personal relationship. Religions begin, true religions begin with the descent of an avatar. And that avatar has a revelation about the nature of reality. And then people become devoted to that avatar because of the power of that revelation, and even more powerful, about the capacity of that avatar to give his experience of bliss to those who are in tune with him. And that experience of bliss is not limited by time or space, and it's not limited by physical proximity, which is why even now souls can become self-realized in devotion to Jesus. Souls can become self-realized in devotion to Krishna. These are physical forms that have been gone from the planet, for very long periods of time. But Master and all the masters say once that divine vibration is created, it exists eternally and is always present for those who wish to tune into it. That's quite a promise when you think about it. But all of us have to come to that from the center of spirit of whoever I am and whatever I'm living. And gradually over time, the revelations of these masters get reinterpreted by disciples who don't quite have the whole picture. I have a friend who is an Episcopal priest and also a disciple of this path. But he was highly educated, not merely in... he was a highly educated priest with advanced degrees in theology from prestigious universities. And then he also came to be a disciple of Master and continued as a priest. At one point, I asked him a certain question about Jesus' teaching, something in the Bible that I didn't quite understand. And he gave me a certain explanation that didn't make any sense to me. And I asked him to explain it, and he actually said to me that, the full revelation of Jesus did not come through until 300 or 400 years after he died. I said, you mean 400 years later, scholars who didn't have a clue what Jesus actually taught just made up something that made more sense to them. And he sort of, looked suitably but sweetly embarrassed by it, made reference to his advanced degrees in theology, and then said sweetly, "My life was much simpler before I met you." Because this is what happens. Master himself made a very big point in the West of the difference between Christianity, which is what Jesus taught, and churchianity, which is what everybody thinks he taught. I had a conversation with a Christian minister who was not a very broad-minded minister, and I was referencing the fact that it was not, we were there for business reasons, so it was a coincidence that we were talking. I referenced that Yogananda taught from both the Bible, the New Testament, and the Bhagavad Gita. And this minister drew himself up and said, "He didn't presume to call himself a Christian, did he?" I said, "He absolutely did." He took it directly from Jesus, not through the church. Suffice to say, I never had a conversation with that minister again. But Master came to say that he came to teach. Now, in the West, he talked about churchianity. He only was in India for that 1 year in 1935. And when he was a young man, he started a school. He didn't really, school for children. He didn't really start the kind of mission that he carried on in the West. This is the incredibly interesting lineage that we've all gotten ourselves involved with. Babaji in the Himalayas, Lahiri living in Varanasi, Sri Yukteswar with his ashram in Puri, and then Paramhansa Yoganandaji in America. And then Swami Kriyananda, an American disciple over there, who then brings it all back to India. I mean, it's just a complete stew. It's just hash, you might even say. It's just all these different categories that we're all used to living with are all just being completely mixed up. When I was living in America, I didn't come to India until 1986. So from 1971 until 1986, my life was entirely at Ananda Village. It was after that I moved to Palo Alto, where I've been for the last 30 years. But prior to that, I was at the village. And let me get this thought there. Oh, yes. And we had, the only thing I can call it is we had this marvelous little fantasy of a Vedic village. I mean, having not the foggiest idea what that would actually be like, but just some combination of imagination and past life memory, especially when we were living at the seclusion retreat where it was so remote and we had these little dusty paths and we went by the moonlight. It was absolutely, it was heaven on earth. And then even afterwards, and we had Indian names, and Swamiji, especially the first 10 years, had himself just very recently come from his years in India, and he was so inclined toward the Indian bhav that he really carried it into our life there. Also, he was trying to train us out of our upbringing. He was trying to make us citizens of the world and to break our cultural narrowness, since most of us actually had very little experience of the world at that time. We've mostly become world travelers, but then most of us did not have a passport and had not been out of the country. It was also a different time then. People didn't travel as easily as they did. So I was living more or less this imaginary life of a Vedic village, which was really not untrue because of the presence of Swami Kriyananda. When I met Swami Kriyananda in 1969, somebody's offering a flower to the devotees here. When I met Swami in 1969, literally when he walked into the room before he spoke, he came in dressed in Indian clothes, which I didn't know. I knew about self-realization. I was actually, I had been studying for a couple of years on my own, mostly Vivekananda and Ramakrishna. I feel like Ramakrishna was my upaguru. He found me first, and he kind of held me by the scruff of the neck until he could deliver me to Swami like this. But he made sure that I didn't wander too far off, because those were dangerous years. I could have done all kinds of things. So it wasn't that I had no idea who Swami was or what he was doing, but I had never seen the living example of what I had been reading. And somehow, by God's grace entirely, pure intuition, he just walked in, and I knew who he was. I knew what he was, is actually a clearer way to say it. Even though I didn't even know how to phrase that, I knew that it was possible to personify these teachings. But I had never seen the living example of it. And because I had never seen a living example, it was confusing to me how it was done. It was this incredibly attractive theory, but I was just living my ordinary life, and I could not figure out how to break out of my ordinary life. And when I saw him, I realized that he could teach me. And I had that disciple's response: where he is, I will go. It was in the Bible, in the Christian Bible, Jesus walks along the shore of the Lake of Galilee, and he sees his chosen disciples, and he says, according to the Bible, "Follow me." And they dropped everything and did. Now, maybe there was more conversation that the Bible doesn't report, and maybe it was made extra dramatic, but I can understand from my own experience that may have happened exactly like that, because they knew what they were seeing. And so they just followed it. So there was a certain truth to my idea of the Vedic village, because we had our master and we were clustered around his feet. Swamiji lived at that time in a dome, which he moved over to the section of Ananda which is called Ayodhya. I'm saying this because some of you have been there. And now that place is called Crystal Hermitage, because there's gardens and there's extensive buildings. At the time that I'm speaking of, all that was there was his dome. It was halfway down a hill. There was nothing but a dirt track to get down to it. You parked a car, but the car was like, well, maybe it's not as much as a quarter of a mile, but at least an eighth of a mile away. It was just the dome, which is now the living room of Crystal Hermitage, was just his house. There was a big panel of windows behind him, and when Swami would give satsang, he'd sit with his back to those windows in a straight chair. Things were very simple. There was just mats on the floor and a little bit of furniture. And we could see out that window. You could see across. It was all forest behind him. And you could see outside, and depending on the weather, and in the evening, it would be, you could see the moon, you could see the stars. Sometimes there was a lot of snow then. You could see the snow. You could see the rain. There was no electricity, so we only had we had gas lights, but they were dim. And then we were mostly sitting on the floor, and it was completely out of time. There was no reference that would make you know where we were. Were we in the catacombs, right after Jesus' crucifixion? Were we sitting with the resurrected Christ? Were we with Master in the Himalayas? Were we with Babaji in the Himalayas? Were we living, some other incarnation? Absolutely. Just no way of knowing. And fabulous. Just when I had a conversation a long time later with Swami Kriyananda, and we were discussing reincarnation. I was a little anxious about it, I think. And I had this concern that Swami's never actually answered. Am I actually wiser, or am I just older? Meaning, if I become young again, will I be as stupid as I was then? Or will this actually stick with me? Because life experience, of course, gives you a perspective. He didn't answer that question. But what he said to me was, the two things that cause reincarnation are longing and regret. Longing for that which we never had, regret about the mistakes that we made, that we still carry with us and wish to make right. He said that's what brings us back again and again. It's really something, you can meditate on that for a long time, and it's a very powerful motivator when longing and regret start gripping our consciousness. But when he said that, I said to Swamiji, I could relive those first 10 years at Ananda in a heartbeat. I said they were heaven on earth. And he smiled and he said, oh, that's different. That's the soul's longing for freedom, and it liberates, it doesn't bind. So coming from all of that, by 1986, when I first came to India, I thought we were Hindus. I didn't know. You know, we did an occasional fire ceremony. We did lots of Sanskrit chanting. So it's very interesting. During those years, Swamiji did a lot of Indian chanting. I mean, the chants from India. He also, from his time here, he'd learned many beautiful songs, and he would often sing those songs for us. Before this time, but toward the end of that first 10 years, when after Swamiji published his own autobiography, The New Path, after he started traveling around the country, all the details of this are in the book that I've written. Do I actually have this? I don't think I actually said this in the book. It would have been worth saying. But there was a certain point where Swami stopped singing that music. And his words actually were, if I sing too much of that music, he said, I completely lose interest in the West. He said, my own bhav is so much with the Indian side. He said, but I have a work to do here in the West. He said, he had to actually renounce it. He had to renounce that aspect of his own inner life in order to be able to do what he was given by God to do in the West. Isn't that interesting? So, but for all those years, we not only lived it ourselves, Swamiji led the way to bring us into that. So in 1986, when I came over with 3 others as guides for a pilgrimage that we took in the Master's footsteps, we took the places in autobiography, you know, where Sri Yukteswar's Mahasamadhi Mandir is, house in Calcutta. We also went to Kashmir at that point. We went to the Shankaracharya temple there where Master had a vision of Mount Washington, I believe, and maybe other places. Anyway, in Varanasi, where in that time you could get into Lahiri's house, so we actually went into Lahiri's house. For a number of years we were able to do that. So I thought I was a Hindu. And I came here, and I actually, for the first time, I actually saw Hinduism. Now, where I live in Silicon Valley, there's like several Hindu temples within a stone's throw of where I live, but they didn't exist then. Now India has come so much to Silicon Valley that, I mean, you can bring your mother-in-law over and she never has to speak English. I mean, that's really what's going on there. But in any case, and then I really saw what Hinduism was, which is the temples and the chanting and the puja, and I mean, I loved it all. It wasn't like it felt foreign to me. I didn't have any trouble just stepping into it. But I realized that Master's teachings were about as Hindu as they were Catholic. And because I grew up in the West, I could tell the difference between what Master was teaching, what the churches were teaching. But it wasn't until I came here that I realized that Master was teaching something other than pujas and pujaris and just all the things that happened, all the different deities and the holidays. Not that there's anything wrong with it or there's anything wrong with Catholicism. But Master brought a new dispensation. Master brought a new expression. Master actually brought, like an avatar always does, a new revelation. Not new in the sense of different, like now I'm going to tell you that Krishna wasn't who he said it was and I'm going to reinterpret Hanuman, not new like that, but just to prune the tree and bring it, and primarily and above all, to make it relevant to us now, where we are. And that doesn't mean everything gets thrown away, but that doesn't mean that everything comes forward either. Something new is being asked of us. We're in a tremendous transition from Kali to Dwapara Yuga. Among the many new revelations that this line of gurus has brought, starting with Sri Yukteswar, and he mentions it in Autobiography of a Yogi. Sri Yukteswar writes it in the Holy Science. What is Kali Yuga? What is Dwapara Yuga? what is the true timing of these and what does it mean? Because the tree has become heavy. Just like my priest friend said to me, he's been schooled in a certain reality that makes him think that this is what it is. And the masters have to prune the tree and come back again. So Master said he was sent by Babaji. And in Autobiography of a Yogi, it says, Jesus and Babaji together. And it's a wonderful paragraph. They're very concerned about what's going on right now. The wars, the race hatred, the religious bigotry, the false things that are being done in the name of so-called God, which have nothing to do with the truth of any of these, and the possibility of wars and economic difficulties. Jesus and Babaji are very concerned about it. I mean, I just love the picture. I don't exactly know how you think about it. Are they sharing a cup of tea on a rock in the Himalayas? Where does it fit? But this is true, and they have planned the salvation of this age. Now that's just a remarkable statement when you realize that Master wouldn't have put a word into the autobiography that wasn't true. They're concerned about it, and they've planned the salvation of this age. And this line of gurus, we have to send a messenger. So they did send a messenger. And Sri Yukteswar tells Master, also in the autobiography, you were the one. You were the appointed one. And so he leaves his home country at great sacrifice and goes to the most uncongenial part of the world for this kind of teaching, where nobody knows anything. He suffers great persecution. Even having dark skin, as he did at that time, did not open doors in America. I mean, it closed a lot of doors. It was after Master's passing that America really began to straighten out that aspect of what our country was like. I mean, that was just one part of what he had to face, because Jesus and Babaji have planned the salvation. So then Master eventually settles in Los Angeles. And naturally, of course, the people he's going to draw to him are Americans. And one of those, which is why we're all here, is Swami Kriyananda, who, Swami Kriyananda has an American passport. His parents were completely American, but he grew up in Europe. I mean, he was neither Indian nor American. He spoke 4 languages, English only being one of them, 3 European languages, by the time he was 10 years old. He'd crossed the Atlantic 6 times. As a child, just back and forth, because his father was stationed outside of the country, but then would bring the family back for holidays and for business meetings and so on. So then we have this character from who knows where, who reads autobiography, Swami Kriyananda. He reads autobiography, and he says the most touching thing about it. He says, from the time I was a child, Swamiji says, I always felt I lived in a world of my own that no one else shared. I mean, that you can also get a picture of what his childhood felt like to him. When I read Autobiography of a Yogi, Swamiji said, by now he's 22 years old, I felt that Master and I lived in the same world. Isn't that an interesting and beautiful way to describe it? Because the feeling that Swamiji had about Master was instantaneous and total and never wavered, never wavered. As soon as he finished the book, he crossed the United States. He went to Master as soon as he could. I know when Swamiji was in India in the last years of his life. That's the only thing he ever talked about. I don't know how many of you saw him. Didn't matter what the topic was. Sooner or later, Swamiji was telling you about finding Autobiography of a Yogi and meeting Master. And it was, in itself, it was such an extraordinary personification of what it means to be a disciple. And it was especially, I'll stop for a moment, I'll diverge for a moment here. It was especially poignant and powerful for those of us who had known Swamiji for a very long time. Swami was 44 when I met him. He was so strong. He was incredibly forceful and had very muscular body and very straight up body. in one absolutely moment of complete folly, which so it was a long circumstance to tell you how he got there, but somehow or another Swamiji was challenging people to arm wrestle and even to leg wrestle. I mean, these were, and he was just winning over everyone. And for some reason, I sat down to arm wrestle with him. He himself looked at me like, "Are you out of your mind?" But for some reason, I thought I would try like this. So, I'm not a big person in any case, but I energized, I could try. So I was up there like that with Swami, and my memory of it is I never felt any physical force. I felt that his willpower defeated me before I even had a chance to do anything. It's like I was totally ready, and then I was finished like that. There was a time warp. There was nothing in between. He just knocked me over with his thought before I could even move like that. I mean, so that's what he was like. He was very strong, and people much stronger than me. That day, there was a young man there who I think was a little bit arrogant about his physical strength, and for some reason, Swami just decided that this needed to be done. But, when you all saw him, such a thing was unthinkable, that he would be capable of it or even inclined toward such a thing. But those of us who knew him earlier, he was so completely different during those American years, partly because he steadfastly held at bay any outward expression of devotion or reverence. And we were not raised as you were raised. Now I come to India and people bring their little children, take the blessings. And so the 2-year-old is taught, in the presence of an elder, you touch their feet or at least make a gesture in that direction, to try to take the blessings. And I mean, I understand what it is. None of that, absolutely none with Swamiji. We never stood up when he came into the room. We never stood up when he left. He would just wander in among us like anyone else. He dressed in ordinary clothes. He favored flowered Hawaiian shirts in the summer and Bermuda shorts. I mean, he was just completely relaxed and natural. And he made it that way because he knew, as young Americans, we had no idea what we were doing. And if he had given us a little template of how we were supposed to behave, we would all just start behaving like we were supposed to behave. And he wanted us to grow our spirituality from the inside out. So whatever you began to understand about who Swami Kriyananda was, it was because you experienced it. And even when it became to your awareness, it was still like, I remember a woman came to me after a couple of years and she said, "It seems to me that everything going on here is emanating from Swami Kriyananda." And the fact that she would say that tells you what our lives were like. And I said, "Yes, that's true, but don't tell anyone." And I really meant that because Swami did not want it to be churchianity. He wanted it to be what we actually knew from intuition. Now, years passed. Swami went to Italy, where they have a fine tradition of saints and tremendous heart intuition, and they began to treat him with more external reverence than we did. And then Americans went to Europe and saw that. Italians came to America, and it crossed our minds that maybe we could express outwardly a little more of what we felt. And then in 2003, he came to India, and everything began to change. But back, as I was starting to say, in contrast to how Swami was at the end, he was teaching us everything about Sanatana Dharma, and we knew basically nothing about Sanatana Dharma. And even what he was teaching was not from the traditional books. He was not bringing the ancient scriptures. He was not singing the Srimad Bhagavatam. We were not celebrating the holidays. We were not putting up deities and doing pujas. Nothing that you would think like that. He was taking the essence of what self-realization is about, pruned of the tree, just the pure revelation of the pure teachings of Christ, the pure teachings of Krishna, which was Master's mission from the Masters, from Babaji, and to show how they were the same. And we were blank slates. Whatever Swami told us about karma, reincarnation, the yugas, the chakras, the kundalini, Kriya Yoga, I mean, there was no reference point. It was just him and an intuitive belief and an extraordinarily compelling presentation. Swami he would talk. He would talk fast. He would talk powerfully. He would just, and I wrote in this book, I said, I felt like he was doing one-man battle against illusion, which in fact he really was. He was from the causal plane of ideas. He was looking at this group of mostly young Americans and just trying to launch us to be master soldiers, really. He was training Krishna's new army. And it wasn't going to be a war with swords. It was a war of ideas. And he had to give us all those ideas and just poured them into us day after day. And for all the years that I lived close to Swami and for all the years that I didn't, whenever he was anywhere near where I was able to go, I just listened to him talk. I listened to the recordings. I read everything that he wrote. I did my very best, to become a good student, not just intellectually, but from the heart. Much of really my whole life. From a very early time, I go back and I find notes from myself. Like, I became a conduit for Swamiji's ideas really early. I have the gift of gab, whatever you want to call it. Words have always come easily to me. I have a profound desire to communicate, tremendous inclination. When something interests me, I really want to pass it on. I'm not a person who just likes to think in solitude. So Swamiji saw in me a mouthpiece. And very early, I started acting out that role. I'll explain about my notes, but I found notes of satsangs I was giving, like I came in 1971 and in early 1972. I'm giving satsangs to the community, explaining Swamiji to the community, which is sort of just what I did. I translated him. Even though he spoke our language, I just translated. I tried to explain to people what was happening with his approval. During that time, I became his secretary for about 4 or 5 years, a job I did until Keshava took over. Keshava, who lives in Delhi now. I got fired and Keshava got moved in. We're still friends. We stayed friends. But I always felt, really from almost the first day, I always felt, let me put it this way. I feel that there are certain characteristics about me that define me. One is that I met Swami at a very young age. For me, I was 22. The second point is that I knew who he was. And there was no evolution to my relationship with Swamiji. When I began to have to write the book that I've just finished, some people, before it was written, there was discussion about how it could be written. And somebody said, well, you could talk about how your relationship with Swami developed. I said, it didn't. Past lives. It was just, there it was. It was complete within about 30 seconds. It was just a memory. But I did have the good fortune from the beginning to know who he was. So I felt very early, and because I was so committed to Swamiji, he invited me to be where he was. His philosophy of leadership, which he passed on to all of us, is you give the most energy to the people who are the most dedicated, who have the most opportunity to be in tune. He said, many leaders make a serious mistake, and they spend all their time trying to persuade the disgruntled, he said. They go off to the edges and try to persuade the disgruntled to be more positive. Swami said, even if you can persuade them to be positive, he said, as soon as you walk away, they will shift back. So Swami's idea of leadership was to find those who have the most potential and give them the most energy, because then they will lift the whole group, the magnetism will increase, plus they will then be able to go forth and multiply. So he saw me as one of those from very early. So within a short time of my being there, I was spending every Sunday afternoon with Swamiji and also seeing him often during the week. He tended to stay in seclusion because he was always writing. The first, maybe, I probably only saw him mostly on the weekends at the beginning because my first assignment was running a kitchen. And kitchens don't give you a lot of space. But I always found space for Swami regardless. People still ate, and I would find space for him one way or another. Their meals might not be all that interesting, but they ate like this. But I knew that I was a witness to greatness, was the only way I could put it. I knew that what I was seeing was uncommon in history. I mean, I would have felt that just by the person, but given his relationship to Paramahansa Yogananda, given my understanding of this path, having no idea of the real potential of what we were doing, but nonetheless, I knew it was powerfully important in history. I don't say that with any pride. It's not like we're so important, but it is very important. Avatars don't come that often, and when they come, we should all stop and notice. And then I could tell that I was seeing someone who had a special mandate. It's very interesting to realize, and it wasn't until I really started working on this book that it came really clearly to me. Swami Kriyananda was 22 years old when he read Autobiography of a Yogi. He immediately became Master's disciple, September 12th, 1948. Master died March 7th, 1952. That's 3.5 years. So, and Swami's birthday is in May. So Swami was not quite 26 when Master left this world. Now, many avatars do not spend a long time with their disciples. Jesus spent 18 years in India and then came back. We don't know the disciples that were in India because that part of his life was taken out of the New Testament and it has yet to be filled in. It's become remarkably accepted now that Jesus was in India, whereas 50 years ago, no one would have said it. But now I found a children's book published by a major Catholic publishing company that's the story of Jesus traveling all over the world and visiting the wise men of the East. I think they snuck that book into that publishing company. I think that they don't really know what they've published. But we don't know about all the disciples that Jesus had in India, but in the West, or in the part that people are known, it was 3.5 years from when he arrived, and they began to follow him until he was gone. So it's not unprecedented. Ramakrishna had a long life, but he didn't draw his disciples till the very end. So even his great disciples only had a few years with him. And all of us met Swamiji after Master had passed, because none of us met Master directly. But Master was so living for Swamiji and so completely active in Swamiji's life. There was no other reality. And he was always, Swamiji never made a point of saying, Master told me, Master came to me in vision, I was meditating and Master said, I would say he never said that. But I would have to say, I can't remember him ever saying that. He never wanted to put us in a position where he was the authority and we just had to obey because he had a message from somewhere that we couldn't access. I mean, I talked about his Hawaiian shirts and his Bermuda shorts. That was just symbolic of something very, very different. If we were going to trust him, he wanted us to trust him because we ourselves had risen to it, not because he'd exerted an authority that we couldn't question. You see how easy it would have been to say, Master said, I was with Master, he told me. To my recollection, never. He inspired us to rise to an understanding, and he talked and he explained things to us. There was one point I remember where he was becoming a little exasperated by our collective stupidity. Mostly he was very patient and he was very supportive and kind, but sometimes in private he would express a little impatience. And this was one of those times, and there was a small group of us there. For some reason, I have this memory of us being lined up on a couch, as if we were sort of like just sitting there like that. And I have this memory of Swami sort of declaiming, standing in front of us. Maybe that's what it felt like. Maybe that's how it actually happened. But he said, you have no idea how easy you have it with me, he said. He said, I bend over backwards to explain things to you. He said, Master never bothered. He said, Master would give you a word, maybe just a look, maybe he'd raise his eyebrow, maybe you'd get a whole sentence, and then he'd just leave you to raise your intuition to understand it. Wow. But Swamiji constantly explained to us, and when he had an idea, I came to believe very quickly that Swami never suggested anything without very strong intuitive guidance from Master that it was the right thing to do. I trusted him completely. And he did lots of very radical things. I would even say some things that people thought were wacky. I always did what I called reverse engineering. If he was doing it, there must be a good reason, so let me see if I can figure out what the reason is. Instead of from, that's a nuts idea, what could he possibly be thinking? Because he never said, Master told me. He never bound us. We had to figure it out. But, let me just pull all these pieces together. Where was I? When I was with him, he was always explaining. He was not just explaining karma and reincarnation. He was always talking about how do we make decisions in life? What is dharma? How do we deal with this difficult person? How do we deal with this financial crisis? How do we deal with the necessity to spread the teachings balanced by this deep desire to just be alone and have seclusion? Just like every issue. And then he would talk. And he would talk about it. And within the first year that I was there, I believe this is when it happened, he said to me, I want you to write a book about me. I think my breath stopped and really didn't start for a really long time after that, because I felt about as incapable of doing that as flying to the moon. I knew that I was a conduit, but the confidence to write about him was just completely outside. And then he kindly said, but not yet, which at least allowed me to, to have my lungs start working again. And then he said, but his words were, if it's explicit between us, I can help you. And even though, he did help me in countless ways ever after. From that day until just a couple of years ago when I was in seclusion writing this book, and it was clear to me that Swami was helping me, which is, I would actually say, I typed his manuscript. That book is what he wanted me to say. And whenever I veered into anything that occurred to me and it wasn't right, he pulled it back. So he just, I was sitting there. The way intuition works is not as simple as automatic writing, but he dictated the book to me. But from the age of 24 until just a couple of years ago, I worried about it every single day. There wasn't a day in my life that it wasn't the mother of all my fears. All my fears emanated from the fact that I had this commission that I didn't have any idea how I was going to deal with. I'd watched Swami write his autobiography. All of this is described in the book, and I knew what was involved. The first day he started writing the path it was called then, which he started he had 2 false starts. And then about 1974, I think it was, and I was working as his secretary. His house was so isolated, there was no email or anything like that in those days. There was no telephones, except there were 2 telephones in the whole of the community. One of them was in the office where I worked, and we also got mail. And in the late afternoon every day, I and Seva and sometimes Kalyani and a few others would take the mail to Swami, take the phone messages, and just give him the news of the day. The day that Swami started writing his autobiography, Master had told him to take notes, and he had all these notes. I came in, and he was sitting on the floor of his office area with all this paper around him. It was not disorderly. It was all in little stacks like this. He'd been at it all day. And when I came in, he didn't get up from the floor. He just sort of looked up with very big eyes like this, and he kind of gestured to all of this, and he said, how am I ever going to turn this into a book about Master? And then later he said he felt like an ant trying to describe Mount Everest. And I felt, is there anything smaller than an ant? Is there anything bigger than Mount Everest? It was just, Swami managed to do it, but I'm not Swamiji. But nonetheless, the assignment was there, and I made several false starts and decided at one point that I would simply die trying. If it was an assignment that I had to carry out, and if I couldn't do it, I would die trying, and that was okay. It's kind of when I decided that that could happen. I think that was one of the ways in which you actually push through things. I actually had an interesting realization, just to speak of myself for a moment, that the necessity to write that book has been the guiding principle of my spiritual life. Everything in my spiritual life has been run by that single fact. And every determined effort I've made against continuous disappointment and failure, which everybody's life is full of, has been guided by the fact that eventually I have to write that book. And stupidly, it only occurred to me like 2 days ago. Of course, that's why he told me to write it. And of course, that's why he told me so early. Because then I was never able to quit. Because it was always there. It was just, I couldn't die without at least trying. And even if I died trying, that was okay. But so the end of all of that is because of the power of that. From that point on, I always had a notebook in my hand. I was never with Swamiji without a pencil and a paper to just take notes on what he said. And he watched me do it, and he rarely commented, but he always knew that I was doing it. And for a period of time, I even carried a recorder, but it inhibited things. When you have a recorder in the middle of the room, you don't feel like you can talk. Even my notebook didn't inhibit things like the presence of that recorder. And then I recorded something that shouldn't have been recorded, and a huge, horrible chaos resulted, and that was the end of the recorder. So I went back to pencil and paper. So by the time Swami had passed and I really decided that I had to work on this, I had 12 full file drawers of paper. And I'm not a person who can put everything into a computer. I know it's in there somewhere, but it's not very real to me. And it also, I don't quite trust it because I don't know where it is. I'm afraid it could vaporize. And no matter how many times my young friends have explained it to me, I have this fundamental distrust. So when I first started working on this book, I spent actually a full year and a half. Because even though I'd taken notes, I'd never kept any. I was not at all systematic. I'm a strange blend of chaos and system. So I conscientiously took all the notes and I saved them all, but I just threw them into threw them into drawers. So I had to pull out sheets of paper and notebooks like this, and I spent a year and a half organizing it, cross-referencing, chronological, making duplicate copies, subjects like this, till I had 12 full file drawers of notes from what was 45 years. I often thought during those years I wasn't taking enough notes. I said to myself, thank God you didn't take more notes. And it actually, literally, I had exactly the right number of notes because I was trying to write the book where I was living in my house, where I had other responsibilities. I had other opportunities to distract myself is really what I would say. There were lots of ways when I could decide I had something else to do. I read a well-known writer said, thank God for writing deadlines. Otherwise, I'd never get my housework done. And I was fulfilling that destiny. And also, I could feel it wasn't working. Just something was wrong. And in quite a sad way, I just stopped. And I don't know, that was a few years ago. There's a time warp here, too. I just stopped for a couple of months. And then I was at a gathering at the village, and Kirtani and Anand, who are the leaders in Assisi, had come over to California, and Anand had owned this property in Washington State up by Canada for years, and they'd finally put a little home on it, a little prefabricated house, not quite a trailer, but something like that, totally isolated. Kirtani, here's where spiritual family comes into it. She didn't even know what I was dealing with. I had told no one. She walks up to me and said, we have this little house. I see you up there writing. She said like that. I said, yes, I'll go on June 1st. Because it occurred to me that I could take all those notes and put them in my car. So this house is 1,000 miles from where I live. I've never seen it before. There's no internet. There's no phone. The nearest neighbor's a mile away. It's absolutely beyond the beyond. And I took all those boxes, and it just fit into my car. If there had been one more box, I couldn't have taken them, really. Hundreds of pounds. I thought my car was broken. I'm driving and driving. I'm trying to think, how am I going to get my car fixed? Finally, I realized I've got 6 obese people in the car with me with all this weight, and it's just the poor thing is trying to get up the hill. But it was filled to the ceiling, and I just stuck my clothes, in the corners between it. And I went up to this cottage, this cabin, which was just people said to me, "Aren't you afraid?" And it just hadn't crossed my mind, not even slightly. And they insisted I get an air horn, something that makes a big noise, just in case something happened. I forgot to tell the neighbor, if you hear this air horn, come over and see me. But I suppose if she'd heard it, she would have eventually figured out that something was happening. But as soon as I was completely alone, Swami started talking to me. And he just started talking to me. And from that point on, I only wrote when I was completely alone. I had to be, and I lived in that house for some months, and then I got a house closer to where I am in California, which also, because the internet password was so complicated, and as soon as I came in, I crumpled it up and threw it away, so I could never get on the internet, and my phone didn't work that well. So I wasn't as physically isolated, but I isolated myself. Completely alone, Swami started talking to me. And I just typed his manuscript. And the book came out very, very, very different than I thought it was. Because, as you can see what I'm like, I mix my life with his life. I skip time and place. Breezy memoir is what I thought I was going to write. But it wasn't at all what he wanted. What he wanted was a chronological account. Well, actually, there's one more thing that's actually really interesting. When I last saw him in India, the last time I saw him, which was March of 2013, and I saw him at his home in Pune. He was sitting in his blue chair, and I was sitting there and talking to him, and I often visited in that house. And he gave me, he basically went like this and told me what the rest of the things I had to do. And I've done 3 of 5. And one of them was, he asked me to write the story of Ananda. And he used this phrase, "Who better than you to do it?" Well, my immediate thought was, a lot of people better than me to do it. Not merely out of modesty, but out of a very practical reason. There's actually 3 locations at what they call Ananda Village. Ayodhya, where Swami lives, the seclusion retreat, where Haridas and I were at the beginning, and then what's known as the village, the village is actually the community. It's where the families live, it's where the children live, where the schools are, where the businesses are. That's really where the community developed. In all my years, I lived at the seclusion retreat. I lived twice at the seclusion retreat, and I lived next door to Swami at Ayodhya, in twice. 2 times here, 2 times here. I never lived in the community. I never had anything to do with the community. Jaya, Sadhana Devi, Jyotish Devi, Haridas was more in it than I was, Binay, lots of people the names that you'll know, they built a community. And I didn't. I worked with Swamiji. Then I went out and I was teaching. I traveled and I was teaching. I cooked at the meditation retreat. I taught at the Expanding Light. I never touched the community. So when he says, "Who better than you to write it?" I thought, Swami, I don't know anything about it. But really, if he had told me to walk to the moon, I would have said, "Absolutely, sir, I'll start in the morning." I just like, for one thing, one never knew at that stage of his life if you'd ever see him again. And if he's going to give me my life instructions, I'm going to take them, and I'm not going to resist. So I just had it there, like, sure. And of course, we knew that there was the book about him that had to be written. I'd already written Swami Kriyananda as we have known him. But it was like a warm-up. It was because I couldn't. I sat down to write the book I finished. I didn't have a chance to write it. So Devi wrote a biography. He asked Devi to write the book, Faith is My Armor, which is a beautiful short biography of Swami, shorter biography of Swami. Freed me to just write stories. But so Swami was going to go to Romania in June. He was going to go back to his home country. It would be the 2nd visit since he left as a boy. And he only wanted a small car. There was a lot of conversation about who was going to go. And eventually it was decided, because I was supposed to write about him, that I would go on that trip. So I had tickets to Romania for June. And on April 21st, Swami passed away. So some people from Europe went to Romania, Narayani and Shivani and a few others, Shurja. They went to Romania in his name, but I didn't feel to come all the way over from the U.S. because it was too far. So I went into seclusion instead during the time I would have been with Swami in Romania. And, I'm thinking about what comes next. And then it occurs to me that the book that I should write about Swami is how he built Ananda. That the story of Ananda that Swami wanted me to write was the story of how Swami did it. And if he hadn't said that to me, you see how interesting it is? If he hadn't said that to me, I'm not sure I would have got what he wanted from me. And so when there he's talking to me, now it's chronological. And it's not the development of my relationship with Swami, because that's, first of all, it's uninteresting, and second of all, there's no plot. It's just there's no story. But it's how he manifested Master's work in the world. So the story of Ananda is just way too small a phrase for it. It's how he fulfilled the commission that Master gave him. You have a great work to do. So as a disciple, what is that great work? What do we do as disciples? I mean, Master set lots of things in motion, but a Master comes with a revelation that is part of Jesus and Babaji's plan for the salvation of the world. Master, as Swami said, streaks across the sky like a meteor, just putting all this power into the universe. But what next? What do we do next? And who's going to do it? And how are we going to do it? So that's what I witnessed. I watched Swami. When you read this book, which I hope you will, it's chronological. Every chapter is a year. Every chapter has a photograph of Swamiji from that year. So you can actually see him as he changed. And about half the book, at least, is Swamiji's own words. And all of those words are from the time, from the chapter that's there. So instead of it being like this, where I tell you the end of, where I spoil the suspense by telling you the end of the story at the beginning, the reader actually lives through what we live through, which is the adventure of trying to, there was a certain point, Swamiji's house, when it was just a dome, had a very high ceiling, like this has a high ceiling. And he divided the space with partitions just so there would be visual privacy in a sense. But the partitions are like about 8 feet high, so there was all that open space above. So his office was behind a partition, and the kitchen was in another area, but we were just like this and we could talk. Something was going on in the community where we were being persecuted a lot by our neighbors. Our immediate neighbors did not like us. They were, for the most part, real dropouts from society. And there was also at that time a lot of marijuana being cultivated, and these were the people cultivating it, and it was a very different culture than the culture of us. Plus, they were not only doing illegal things, but their attitude was one of just a curse beyond society. We want to have nothing to do with it. Right in the middle of them is Ananda, saying to the whole world, come and visit, see what we're doing, And they rightly were a little nervous about us being, and we were such pure, clean people, It just was a conflict like this. So they were always trying, plus as Swamiji said, they were anti-authority on principle, Swami said, if negativity could be a principle. And he said there was no other authority in the area except him. So they assumed that he was an abusive, dictatorial leader. They didn't even know him. They didn't even recognize him on the street, but this was what was going on. So it actually came down to, we had a mailbox on the street, big mailbox, and then the mail would be delivered there, and then we'd take it down our driveway to our own land. And they kept knocking down that mailbox, and we kept putting up a stronger, bigger mailbox, and then they would knock it down. And finally, this man named Kent White, who's a big man and is he refurbishes like airplane motors and cars. I mean, he's a very mechanical guy. He sank a concrete pillar like 4 feet down into the ground and 4 feet up, and made this big metal box and bolted the box on like that. And it lasted for really quite a long time because even with a truck, if you tried to knock it down, it would hurt your truck. But then somebody finally figured out how to pry the box off the top. So the pedestal was still there, but it was just blank because the box had been taken off. So, I mean, it was between annoying and amusing. It got to be kind of like a little bit of a battle between the two forces. So they had done that. And I had to come over and tell Swami that once again they'd managed to destroy the mailbox. And I presented it as, I mean, Swami actually started laughing because he had to admire their perseverance, you know. and he had to admire the fact that they'd finally, you know, they'd won. They'd conquered us one more time. And then he went off to sit in his office, and I heard him typing like this, and I went up to make tea or to make lunch. We're not very far away from each other. He's typing. The typing stops. He calls across the partition, Asha! He had a very big voice. Asha! You have to understand, we're trying to transform all of society, and naturally it will take a little time. And then he just goes back to what he was doing like that. So that's it. That's the project. We have, you know, this is a new expression. Master said that self-realization has come to unite all religions. And he doesn't mean this is the new Catholic Church or whatever the Hindu equivalent of that would be, which thank God I think there isn't one. But in any case, it's not like this is the big new institution under which everything else will be umbrellaed. It's the exact opposite. Master chose self-realization because it's a generic term. It's a concept. It's nobody's name. We actually had to litigate that for years in America because people were getting exclusive trademarks on generic words because the American Copyright Office had never heard of them. And so if you came in and said this was original, the Pitta, Vata, and those had actually been copyrighted. And Siddha, I mean, words that like nobody should own. And we ended up in litigation for years on it, which is also described in the book, and actually broke that whole trend, which was an extremely important thing to break. But Master called it self-realization because that's what it is. And he said, and this is what it says in autobiography, this is what Babaji and Jesus have figured out. Give people actual experience of the presence of God within them, and they will not be able to then attack others because they will know that God in me is the same God in you. And it won't be a dogma, and it won't be a priest, and it won't be an institution, and it won't be a ritual. It will be my experience. And then when I know it, then I will live by it. But naturally, this will take a little time. So Ananda became the sort of starting point for Swamiji, by no means the ending point, and by no means the definition of his mission. But he had to start somewhere. And the way Swami has often talked about this, the way transformation takes place in society, if you look historically, he was extremely well educated in ways that that elude me completely. But every major historical shift has always been a small group of people working together. And it's the way I think it's the river of society runs like this, and a small group of people start creating a whirlpool like this, with power, people with power, and gradually society reroots itself through it. You know, I've been 50 years on the spiritual path. When we started, yoga and meditation completely unknown, vegetarianism completely lunatic. One of my relatives made me submit my entire diet to a doctor because they thought I wouldn't live to see 30. Yeah, it was that serious. The doctor pronounced my diet the healthiest diet he had ever seen, predicted that I would outlive all of them, by 50 years. Well, so far I have outlived all of them, but not by 50 years yet. Just time has passed. But in America now, this is where I live in California. This is what I say. Everybody knows about meditation. Not everybody meditates. But the people who don't meditate feel guilty because they don't meditate, which I think is incredible progress. That's the beginning of the transformation of all of society. And when Master said to Swamiji, you have a great work to do, he didn't define it. He did say you're going to write, you're going to edit, you're going to lecture, but that's pretty big. I mean, basically what he was telling him is you're not going to the Himalayas to meditate. You're going to work, and you're going to work outwardly. And so Swami did. I can't remember a single day in which he didn't do something serviceful or creative. You know, even in the hospital, he would end up counseling a doctor or blessing someone who was there helping him. And just every day, he would be writing music, because he just had this commission. And when the light pushes forward like that, the shadow comes and tries to snuff it out. So because Swamiji worked so hard to explain it to us, and because Swamiji never justified himself with intuition that we couldn't access, what he ended up, which he dictated to me and I tried to write by pulling all his own words into it, is it's a how to live. It's how do we live? How do we live? How do we serve? How do we fulfill whatever mandate we have received from God to be disciples and to be his instrument? And not in some sort of otherworldly context, but just really, you know, today someone is betraying me. Tomorrow, my relied upon helper has become ill and I can't deal with it. I myself am sick. I've run out of money. Somebody's changed it. People have sued me. You know, just I feel called to do something. I don't know how the energy is going to come together. Just step after step. But all of it with this sort of vision of discipleship. And for a while, the name of this book was Swami Kriyananda Disciple. We all sort of liked that for a while, but in the West, at least, disciple, that word is often co-opted by disciples of Jesus. And we decided we didn't want to narrow it. But actually, this title was offered, and once again, Swami just said, that's the title, Lightbearer. You know, and we define it. A Lightbearer is one who, by his very consciousness, uplifts the consciousness of others. And that's our mandate, all of us, and that's our challenge, which is how do we hold to that? And you know, people have asked me, because I had so much direct contact with Swamiji, so much of my relationship was in this world, you know, emails, telephone calls. Of course, I, like everyone else, in 2013, he disappeared. It was so strange. When we went, a group of us went from America to Assisi, where Swami had died, just the day after, just in order to be there, to be together. And I had traveled many times to be with Swami, to many parts of the world. And Swami was the geographic center of my universe, is how I would put it. The world always had a center point, because wherever he was, whatever city, whatever country, that, and I realized much more than I knew, I was always relating to that geographic center. Everything was in relation, even though for much of my life I was hundreds or thousands of miles away. But I would always, whenever it was appropriate, I would go see him, which would be multiple times a year. He would come and stay in the house I lived in. So it was always there. And whenever I would be going to see him after an absence, there would be one priority, which would be to get there, like this. So we landed, a small, 3 or 4 of us came together. We landed in Rome. We were walking wherever we were going. I don't know if we were getting a car or a train. We saw Kirtani and Anand sitting there. They were waiting for Jyotish and Devi to come. Then when Jyotish and Devi arrived, we knew that 2 or 3 others were coming. We sat for like 2.5 hours and drank coffee in the Rome airport, just waiting for all the Americans to arrive so that we could go together. That was when I realized Swami had died. Because how could I just be sitting here? It's like, why wasn't I streaking? And I realized there was no place to streak to. It was a very disconcerting, is the only way I can think about it. And I mean, I couldn't be so selfish as to wish Swami had not died. His body was so old. He was so eager to be free. He'd given us so much. I just couldn't say, oh, please don't go. It would just be unthinkable. Even then, I couldn't say it. But I was like this. And then there's his body. The casket's open for the 8 days that we were there. There's his body. And then his voice is coming over the loudspeaker. And once again, it's like this complete, almost physically dizzy. You know, where is the point? And of course, time passes, and Swami's guidance to me for decades had been not, here's what you should do, but it had just been this feeling that this is what I should do. And this confidence that I always somehow knew what to do. And I would just go forward and knowing what to do, and most of the time it would work out. Sometimes I wasn't right, but it was a flow. But when I sat down to write this book, Swami just was back in the room. And he was just talking to me and arguing with me sometimes and teasing me. And even like to one, I can't remember now the example, but I stuck in an adjective for something, and I knew it was a word Swami had never used in that context. And I kept hearing him tell me, reminding me, it's not a word I would use. And I kept saying, but it's a good word, sir, it explains it. No, actually it doesn't. It's not a good word. And he just nagged at me, and then I went and I took it out. Never came again. Once I wrote a sentence that was, it's the kind of sentence where it almost makes sense but didn't quite, just throw in a few good words like God, guru, devotion. You just kind of string them together. Just kind of run them together and it almost makes sense. And I knew he wouldn't like it. But I liked it. I thought it was good. And really, literally, I'd take these little walks and we would have this conversation. He would say, Asha. I said, but Swami, look, it's so poetic, it's pretty, Asha. It doesn't say anything. Well, it almost says something, don't you think so? And finally, literally, I hear him laughing, I'm laughing. It's like, all right, I'll go and I'll take it out. And I take it out, he never brings it up again. Now, for me, of course, that was quite remarkable. And outside of being in that seclusion writing that book, it comes and goes. But I think of all those years, those years that Swamiji, Master was gone. But I didn't even know Master was gone. Because Swamiji was so attuned to his presence that it didn't occur to me really until I was writing this book that almost all of Swamiji's life was inner attunement. Because then I'm writing the book and I realized time and space means nothing to these great souls. Absolutely nothing. And it's just up to us. If we're going to be instruments, we will be. And circumstances have nothing to do with it. It just has to do with whether or not, how deeply we want it, really. In my early years with Swamiji, when I was often with him, other people would, there was a little bit of that sort of thing. Why do you always get to be with him and I don't get to be with him? And there was nothing much that I could say. It's not a conversation you really want to have. But I actually asked myself inwardly. And it was real simple. When I was working for Swamiji, actually all my life, really. But when I was working for him, we would go over there at 4 p.m, and sometimes we'd leave it at 5. But more often we'd leave at 8 or 9 or 10 or 11 or 12 or 1 or 2. I mean, something would happen. I never made any plans, ever. Because if Swami wanted something from me or I had an opportunity to be with him, I never wanted to say I can't, ever. And even when I would visit with him, I thank God when we finally got cell phones, because it allowed me to walk away from the landline. Because then wherever I was, and I always stayed in very close proximity. So I realized when people would ask me, the reason is because there's nothing else that matters to me but this. And somebody also asked a question, and this is, I think, the end of what I'm going to say here. They were sort of talking about what did Swami, of who you are, what did you bring to the table, and what was Swami's grace? My answer was it was always grace. I mean, really, my really very unattractive comment is if I hadn't met Swami, I would be dead in a ditch, and I would have been dead in a ditch a long time ago. I was a little out of the box. But they asked me what did I bring, and just as a disciple, I want to say, all is Guru's grace. But she kept insisting. I mean, I was naturally talented. I have certain gifts. That was just, I was born in a privileged situation. But none of that really mattered. But what I realized, what I brought to the table was very important. I am a truth seeker. And that, I want the truth. I want the truth about life. I want the truth about myself. I want the truth about every single situation. And Swami could work with that. Because he knew that no matter what happened, I would cling to that single thing, which is I want the truth. the cosmic truth, not the little truth, but the cosmic truth. And so I realized that was Swami, of course. That's why Master could work with him. That's why he said, you have a great work to do. That's why Swami could say to me, you have to write this book, and it would take me my whole life to get myself organized to do it. But I was a truth seeker. He'd given me that truth. I would do it. And that is not as hard as you think. When you simplify it down to that, it takes away all the form. I'm a householder, I'm a sannyasi, I'm rich, I'm poor, I'm old, I'm young, I'm anything. No, I just want the truth. What is happening right now, God, and what do you want of me? And if we just ask that question over and over again, they'll answer us, because that's the question they want to answer. They don't really care whether we marry or have children or what city we live in. Really, we think it's very important, but they don't care. All they want to know is, do you love me? Are you with me? Do you want to serve? Do you have the courage? And once you do that, they're lining the road. They're just lining the road to just take us down to a place that all the masters say is there, and little by little it begins to reveal itself for us. Isn't that wonderful? All right, dear friends. That's what I have to say.